or would he prefer to continue and then I'll just follow the flow? Whatever is more
May
convenient to
the
His Honor.
chair suggest that we, I don't know how many amendments the lady has.
Well, actually, just for the record, I submitted all to him.
Yeah.
He accepted 2 of my 100 amendments. No, I'm just kidding. 2 of 11.
Can we proceed because, for example, the Senator Zubiri proposed an amendment on page 49, which proposes to renumber the succeeding section. So, can we proceed with the amendments with the indulgence of Senator Pia in accordance with the sequence and chronology?
And I will just stand up if I
Yes,
have an amendment.
that would be most ideal. If the lady would
More than
acquiesce.
it is perfect, Mr. President. I would do. That's what I would do if I was the chair.
Thank you, Your Honor. Senator Gatchalian is recognized to propose his amendments.
So you'll tell me? Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on page 11, delete the clause beginning with the word communicate in line 24 and ending with the word period on page 12, line 3. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, amendment is approved.
Anterior na lang. Para hindi magulo. Anterior na lang. On page 12, line 3, insert the paragraph, within the 90-day period, communicate in writing to the taxpayer the legal and factual basis for the denial, including the deficiencies of the VAT refund claim, period. The taxpayer shall have 15 days from receipt of the denial to file a request for reconsideration, period. The Commissioner shall decide on the request for reconsideration within 15 days from the receipt thereof, period. Failure to file a request for reconsideration within 15-day period shall render the decision final. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 16, line 13, after the word directly, insert the words attributable. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page 22, line 23, delete the phrase at the option of the RBE. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page 22, line 30, delete the word for, and after the word enterprises, insert the phrase may opt for one of the following. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page 23, line 9, delete the word section and replace with sections. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page 23, line 10, before the word of, sorry. Ito? Before the word of. Sorry. On page 23, line 10, before the word of, insert the words N296-A. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page 23, line 12, delete the word for and insert the phrase may opt for either after the word enterprises. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page 23, line 18, delete the word section and replace with sections. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page 23, line 19, before the word of, insert the words N296-A. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page 28, line 17, after...
Senator Cayetano is recognized for an antecedent amendment to page 28, line 17.
Yeah, 25, Mr. President.
What page, Your
Page
Honor?
25, Mr. President.
Page 25,
Line 5.
line 5.
Yes. So, before I make the amendment, I just want to put on record that this amendment was submitted to the chairperson and it was rejected. So I just want to explain the reason for the amendment and hear His Honor's response. Sorry, I have
Which one?
two amendments on page 25.
Which one?
We're on page 25. But there's another one. Yeah. So first is, as I mentioned, page 25, line 5, the inclusion of FIRB was accepted by His Honor. Thank you for that. So I'd like to thank you before I then question why you rejected my next amendment. So the next one is on page 25, line 15. And to explain, the amendment here was also to include FIRB for consistency. The amendment is for FIRB to be included in issuing authority to import capital equipment, raw materials, spare parts, or accessories pending the issuance of certificate of registration, as it is the body that grants incentives for RBAs with investment capital above 15 billion. So we're just being consistent. So we'd just like to know why this was rejected, since it's really a matter of consistency.
Is that Mr.
Page
President?
25, line 15.
Ito. Is that, Mr. President, let me just read the provision. An investment promotion agency may authorize the importation of capital equipment, raw materials, spare parts. Is that the one, Mr.
Yes,
President?
so the amendment we propose is that you include FIRB along with the current along with the current, the IPAs, because you did recognize that FIRB will be the approving body for 15 billion and above, so should they not also be the body that authorizes the importation of capital equipment, raw materials, et cetera, for 15 billion and above?
Yeah. Well, Mr. President, I consulted with the IPAs and FIRB. The authorization to import capital equipment, raw materials, spare parts is a responsibility of the IPA.
Okay.
So, for example, because this pertains to operation, so actual importation on the ground. So, from what I was briefed, once FIRB approves the investment above 15 billion, the IPAs now take jurisdiction insofar as operations is concerned, and they're the ones who will issue the authorization on the importation of capital equipment and
Okay.
others, Mr.
Well,
President. So
no,
that is the...
My usual concern with IPAs is they tend to be too magnanimous. So I would assume in this case, we want them to be magnanimous
Yes.
because we already allowed them to come in with 15 billion. So I thought for consistency, you would want to include FIRB. But
Yeah.
that's why, like I said, the purpose for my taking the floor now is to just hear
Yeah.
the explanation, and I'm okay
Correct.
with it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. We actually studied the recommendations and the amendments of Her Honor, and that's why when we consulted with the FIRB, and the process is, once FIRB approves the investment, it's the IPAs now who will issue the permits, for example, even operating permits, building permits, and the other permits,
We
Mr.
can accept
President.
that, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cayetano.
So
The sponsor may proceed. Page 28, line 17.
Thank you, Mr. President. On page 28, line 17, after the semicolon, insert the word "and." I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 28, line 18, change the word "seller" to "purchaser" and delete lines 25 to 30. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 28, line 24, after the semicolon, delete the word "and." I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 28, lines 25 to 30. Page 28, delete lines 25 to 30. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 28, after line 30, insert a proviso, provided that local sales of goods and slash or services by a registered business enterprise, regardless of the income tax incentive regime and location, shall be subject to 12% VAT, 12% VAT, unless otherwise subject to VAT exemption or VAT zero rating under titles 4 and 8. 4 and 13 of this code, period. For this purpose, local sales shall cover sales of goods and services to domestic market enterprises or non-RBEs, regardless if the sale is made within the free port or economic zones, provided further that the liability to pay and remit the VAT to the government is with the buyer of the said goods or services. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 32, line 17, delete the phrase or entirely new. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 32, line 19, replace the word section with sections. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 33, line 22, reinstate the deleted words project or activity. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 37, line 19, after the word purchases, add the phrase and VAT exemption on importation. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 37, line 21, after the word purchases, add the phrase and VAT exemption on importation. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 38, line 23, delete the phrase or entirely new. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, the same is approved.
On page 38, line 26, replace the number 295 with the number 294. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, the same is approved.
On page 39, line 29, delete the phrase.
I have on page
Thank you.
Senator Cayetano is recognized for an antecedent amendment to page 39.
Mr. President, this provision has to do with the extension of incentives, and we note that the current version of the committee states that even if the registered project or activity no longer complies with the conditions and qualifications set forth in the SIPP, but they employ 10,000 direct local employees and maintain said number during its registration, they can avail of the extension. That is, my understanding is correct. Is that it?
Yes, Mr. President. And that is, Mr. President, that's a suggestion that came out of the technical working group because we have enterprises that hire at least 10,000 workers and beyond. And some of these industries are garments, so meaning they can move their operations in other countries. And the fear, Mr. President, of these businesses is once their incentives end, these businesses can leave the country, set up in Bangladesh, and 10,000 people will be unemployed, Mr. President. So we took that in consideration and included that in the bill, Mr. President. That's the rationale.
So this is really somehow targeted for the garment industry.
One of which, Mr. President.
What would the others be?
But the garment industry is also one of the is the one who suggested this.
Yes.
Shipbuilding is another industry, Mr. President. Electronics is also another one, Mr. President.
Okay.
But it's the garment industry who are who proposed this measure.
This representation is mindful of the importance of job security
Yeah.
and job creation, and in this case, it's job security because the jobs
Correct,
were already
Mr. President.
created. I think it should just be made very, very clear in our economic strategies that this weighs heavily
Yes.
in our decision, because in the previous discussions of CREATE and even in the discussions now, we're always talking about more value added.
Yes.
Improving what's that term? The value chain.
The value chain. Mr. President.
And of course, we recognize that, but in fact, we are home to a garment industry which is not very high on the garment chain, but high on the employment.
Yeah, Mr. President.
But I don't think this is the time for, I don't think that CREATE more unless His Honor has creative juices that will allow a provision to be included. I don't have it in mind, but the concern is how do we then really push for that improvement in the enticement of companies that have better value added or have more science and technology, because then we really will just continue to be home to these types of enterprises. And again, this representation is cognizant and is grateful that there are jobs being provided for our people, but we just don't want to lose sight of our desire because other countries have moved forward.
Yeah.
No, a lot of countries that we started out with as garment manufacturers are not really involved in garment manufacturing anymore. So I just
Yeah.
parked that with His Honor because
I-
it's a concern I'm sure His Honor has also come across.
Yeah.
But I recognize the need to support employment, so I will
Yeah,
not
Ms.
push for this. I just wanted to get a clear explanation and to put on record that we need to hear more from DTI in particular, maybe FIRB, on what they will be doing to really level up the kind of investments we want coming into the country. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is actually the only criteria that allows extension on this in this bill,
10,000.
the 10,000 employment, Mr. President. And this was really a very long thought process, Mr. President, because admittedly some industries, like the garment in particular, it can be easily be moved in other countries. No? And 10,000 jobs is still 10,000 jobs, Mr. President. So we weighed the pros and cons of this proposal, and we decided that the only time that we will allow extension on a very limited basis is when this entity will have 10,000 employment capacity, Mr. President. So that's the only one we included in the bill. Aside from that, Mr. President, I totally agree with Her Honor that it should be value creating, and SIPP is designed to create value, Mr. President. So thank you for that
Thank you.
intervention. Ten years.
I also have another one on page 38, Mr. President.
May we know the page number from the Honorable Cayetano?
38,
38. Still on 38.
yes.
Na siya not exceed 10 years for direct local.
Same criteria, pero magkaiba sila.
Yeah.
This may just be a clarification, Mr. President. The provision starts on page 37, actually, Section 296A on line 26, which refers to approved incentives approved by the FIRB. And then later on page 38, it's still the same section, it refers to the provision on extension. It states that the extension of availment of incentives shall not exceed 10 years, subject to the performance review by the IPA. So just for consistency, is the position of the chairperson, even if FIRB was the granting authority, the decision to extend is also now given to the implementing agency? The IPA, which is what His Honor said earlier.
This is in relation to 2968, di ba? 2968 is, yeah.
Apparently, the only condition here is 10,000, so
Yeah.
it does not really require a very difficult review.
It connects to here. Yeah, okay.
Is that the reason? So my question is, we have a situation where FIRB approved the incentives, and then at the time of the company is now requesting for an extension because they have 10,000 employees, and it is the IPA that will be reviewing, making the performance review and granting it. So is the logic the same as that explained to me earlier?
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, after looking at the title, Mr. President, it seems like that we should amend IPA to FIRB, Mr. President. I think that...
Well, that was my amendment, but
Thank you.
I thought, following the logic earlier, that you want the implementing agencies to be the one to...
The IPA.
The IPA, the IPA is the implementing agency, then I just assume that is the reason this representation's amendment was rejected.
Yeah, well, Mr. President, after reading it, it's the 296A refers to activities approved by Fiscal Incentives Review Board.
Yes.
And since the extension is also, well, if the business will extend and the business went through the FIRB because
Yeah.
of the size, then the extension should also be approved by FIRB, Mr.
Okay, so
President.
on that note, my amendment will
Thank
be
you, Mr.
accepted.
President. Yeah. Thank
Can you, for clarity, can the lady please state her amendment
Yes.
for the record so that the sponsor can accept for the record as well?
On page 38, line 18, delete the phrase investment promotion agencies and replace it with fiscal incentive review board.
Shall not exceed 10 years, subject to the performance.
Line 20.
Yes. Subject ano siya eh. 2968. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. President. We accept the amendment, Mr.
Thank
President.
you. There's still another one also on page 38.
Accepted. There being no objection, the proposed amendment, having been accepted by the principal sponsor, the same is hereby approved.
Tama.
Senator Pia?
Yes, my next amendment is very similar. It's on page 38, line 28. Delete investment promotion agency and replace it with, ano? No.
Subject to the provisions of the section.
A minute suspension, Mr. President. I don't understand.
Session is suspended.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed. Senator Cayetano is recognized.
Thank you. Let me explain first so it's easier for the chairperson to follow because even I got a bit confused. So there is reference in this section to the IPA. So the purpose of this amendment is to remove IPA and leave Fiscal Incentive Review Board, which is already there. So I'll make the amendment now. On page 38, line 28, delete the phrase investment promotion agency or, and then on the same page, line 29, delete comma as the case may be.
I accept, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment as accepted by the sponsor? There being none, proposed amendment is approved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the good gentle lady for making those amendments so that the approval process will be very clear, depending on the investment size, Mr. President. So,
Actually, Mr. President, I have a similar amendment in the same section, but it's already on page 39, unless you have something.
Mr. President, we can pursue that
Okay.
amendment.
So on page 39, line 23, delete the phrase or the investment promotion agency as the case may be.
I accept, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Any objection to the proposed amendment as accepted by the sponsor? There being none, same is approved.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
The sponsor is once again recognized to continue with his individual amendments.
Thank you, Mr. President. On page 39, line 29, delete. Page 14 na tayo. On page, sure ka?
No, correct.
Wala pa
39, line 29. We didn't
pa
continue with that
na-check.
amendment earlier.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. On page 39, line 29, delete the phrase or entirely new. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 40, line 1, replace number 295 with number 294. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 43, line 13, after the word purchases, add the phrase and VAT exemption on importation. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 43, line 15, after the word purchases, add the phrase and VAT exemption on importation. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 47, line 12, delete the phrase willful and material misrepresentation or submission of falsified and misleading information or documents. So move, Mr. President.
That's falsified or.
Falsified or misleading information or documents. So move, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 53, delete lines 7 to 10 and insert section 308 of the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997 as amended is hereby further amended to read as follows, : So move, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page
Just to note for the Secretariat that an antecedent amendment to this last amendment of the sponsor was earlier approved as proposed by Senator Zubiri, which among others calls for the renumbering of the succeeding sections accordingly. For the record, you may
Thank you.
continue.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator
President.
Gatchalian.
On page 53, delete lines 11 to 12. So move, Mr. President.
Can we approve this amendment? Any objection? Hearing none, proposed deletion of lines 11 to 12 on page 53 is hereby approved. Senator Cayetano is recognized for an antecedent amendment.
Yes. Thank you. I have two amendments. One is on page 49 and one is on page 50. I would like to explain it first, just to make it easier for the chairman to understand the reason for the amendments. I will start with page 50. Under the CREATE law, the recommendation of FIRB is necessary before the President can modify the mix, period, or manner of availment of incentives. But it appears that under the CREATE More bill, This has been changed, and the wording of Section 301 refers to the recommendation of the FIRB as an or. So it says the President may, in the interest of national economic development, or upon the recommendation of the FIRB. So in other words, the recommendation of FIRB is not necessary. The amendment of this representation was for it to be an and, because that is the reason for the FIRB's existence, to make recommendations. So, but before His Honor replies, I would like to point out that on page 51, line 20 to 26, and I just have to go to that page. Line 20 to 26, a new paragraph was inserted stating that the FIRB shall guide the President in calibrating either or both the magnitude of incentives to be granted and the agreed performance target corresponding to the grant. So this provision is consistent with the position of this representation, that the FIRB is there to guide the President. It is there in this bill. However, it appears now to be inconsistent with the earlier section I read, where the recommendation of FIRB is no longer a necessity. So may we hear from His Honor which, if the guidance is necessary, then I think my earlier amendment to make that an end can be reconsidered by His Honor.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. President. Mr. President, in our discussion internally, Mr. President, we wanted to give the President the flexibility to modify the mix of to basically give the President the power to modify the mix of incentives and the period of incentive, Mr. President. Because in the preceding section, can you see the preceding section? It's already spelled out very detailed criteria on what type of investments can the President approve, Mr. President. Let me just get the... So, Mr. President, for example, and let me just read on page 53, line 23. Sorry.
Ito po, page 52, line 1 on the clean copy.
On page 52 on the clean copy, the investment should, or the project has a comprehensive sustainable development plan with clear, inclusive business approaches and high level of sophistication in innovation. So that's one criteria. Number two, minimum investment capital of 50 billion pesos or its equivalent in US dollars, or a minimum direct local employment generation of at least 10,000 with 3 years from the issuance of a certificate of entitlement. So the thought process here, Mr. President, once the business qualifies under these two criteria, the President should be given that flexibility to immediately approve the project so that he doesn't need to wait for FIRB to make that recommendation anymore, Mr. President. So it's just giving the President that flexibility, since we already spelled out in the bill what type of project or investments will fall under his powers, Mr. President. So that is the rationale, Mr. President, why we made it or, Mr. President. Ito ba yun? Is this the one?
I understand what His Honor is saying. I am of the view, though, that it may be, the bill can be a little bit more precise. Mr. President, let me explain what my understanding of His Honor's explanation is. His Honor states that the President has the power to exercise his decision to grant incentives, provided that two conditions are met. One is that there's a comprehensive sustainable development plan, and two, that the investment, the minimum investment is 50 billion pesos. Correct?
Yes, Mr.
Yeah,
President.
so if that happens, the President may exercise these powers. But there's a paragraph before that, which is what I read into the record. It says the Fiscal Incentives Review Board's determination of whether the benefits far outweigh the cost of the fiscal incentives to be granted shall guide the President in calibrating either or both the magnitude of the incentives to be granted and the agreed performance target corresponding to the grant. So maybe His Honor can explain, because on the one hand, the chairman said that as long as these conditions are met, the President may exercise his powers under this section. But the paragraph before that refers to the FIRB weighing the cost of the incentives and guiding the President to calibrate. So even to this representation, I'm a little bit confused. Is that guidance even necessary, or is it automatic when those conditions are met? And then further confused, this representation is further confused by, like I said, the inclusion of the, ano ba tawag sa or? Conjunction? Or, because it will basically disregard FIRB. It just says that the President may, in the interest of national economic development. So why would you need a provision discussing the calibration by the FIRB if the earlier paragraph just says in the interest of national economic development, the President can make a decision? I think it is very important that we are clear so that the President and the FIRB are properly guided when they implement this law, Mr. President.
Modify the mixed period for but all it says is we would be. Hindi pa siya modify the mixed so some point of with this insert be a guide. But hindi naman siya kapakinggan.
What does the sponsor say?
1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session is suspended.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe that Her Honor recommends to reinstate the word "and" rather than "or" because the amendment of Senator Risa gave the Fiscal Incentives Review Board a task to guide the President. So to make it more definitive that the guide will be part of the decision of the President to modify the mix, the period of or manner of availment, it's best that the FIRB is part of that recommendation, Mr. President. So we accept the
Can we ask the distinguished lady to kindly propose her amendment once again for clarity, and so that for the records it may be accepted by the sponsor. Senator Cayetano is recognized to propose her amendment.
Yes, Mr. President. On page 50, line 30 to 31, delete the word "or" and replace it with "and." We
I
submit.
accept, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Hearing none, same is approved. Senator Gatchalian is recognized. Senator Cayetano, may Senator Gatchalian continue?
My next is on page 54.
I have also page 54, Ms. 54.
What line, Senator Cayetano?
Mine is on line 15.
Senator Gatchalian is recognized for his proposed amendment on line 8.
8, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. On page 54, line 8, reinstate the phrase due process. So moved, Mr. President.
After due process.
So reinstate the phrase after due process. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 54, reinstate the word "the" on line 8. And also lines 9 to 14. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection to the proposed amendment? Hearing none, same is approved.
Tama ba?
On page 54, line 8, state beginning the word after until the word code, line 14.
So mali. Mali ito? Can you write it down? 1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session is suspended.
So ito wala na.
After due process and how about sir, wala na.
Wala na ito. Oo nga. Pati kung may nasa ko, 54. 54. Ito.
Para mas malinaw po, kasi nalilito po sila dito sa dalawa.
Okay. Yung last two, 54? Okay. 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 Session is resumed. The sponsor is recognized.
Mr. President, with your indulgence, would like to withdraw my amendment on page 54, line 8, reinstating the phrase "after due process," and at the same time withdraw my proposal on page 54, reinstating the word "the" on line 8 and also lines 9 to 14, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, the withdrawal of the aforestated amendments is hereby approved.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, with the indulgence of the chairperson, my amendment is on line 15. Should I proceed?
There is an amendment on line 13 and then
Okay.
14.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Which is itong dalawa na.
15 pa ako.
Senator Gatchalian, your proposed amendment to lines 13 and 14, given that Senator Cayetano's amendments would refer to line 15.
I'll start with this. Okay. All right, Mr. President, sorry for the delay. On page 54, reinstate the paragraph beginning with the word "after" on line 8, ending with the word "code" on line 14. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On line,
On page 54,
on page 54, line 8, delete the words "the Fiscal Incentives Review Board." Or, I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
On page, okay. On page 54, line 12, after the word "any," insert "willful end." I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none,
Ito na.
same is approved.
Okay. On page 54, line 13, after the previously deleted word "information," insert the phrase "or submission of falsified or misleading information or documents." I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
Okay.
On
Mr. President, sorry, can I make an observation on page 54?
Yes,
His Honor had page 54, line 8. His Honor reinstated that paragraph that start on line 8, no?
Yes,
After
Mr.
due
President.
process, but deleted FIRB, is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, so the concern of this representation would be the same, that it says after due process, the concerned IPA may cancel the registration, suspend the enjoyment of incentives, and so on and so forth. I was of the view that in the entire discussion on the floor in the past 45 minutes, His Honor took the position that if it is FIRB who granted, then FIRB would also have the power to cancel and suspend, in which case FIRB should still be on line 8. That is our observation. And if so, we would like to move to reinstate FIRB
Yeah.
on line 8.
Yeah, Mr. President, what we did throughout the bill, Mr. President, is to harmonize the scope and coverage of FIRB and the scope and coverage of the IPAs, Mr. President. So in this provision, Mr. President, we um, in this provision, Mr. President, we specifically assigned the investment promotion agency the responsibility to cancel registration, suspend the enjoyment of incentives, benefits of any registered enterprise. So in other words, Mr. President, the IPAs in this case deals directly with the RBEs, Mr. President. So there's a hierarchy that we propose throughout the bill that the IPAs will now deal directly with the RBEs, and if there are for example, material misrepresentation of information, this type of penalties, it's the IPA that will impose the cancellation of registration to the RBEs, Mr. President. So it's a hierarchy, Mr. President, that we propose in the bill. President.
I just want to point out, Mr. President, that in the earlier amendments of this representation, we discussed that for the review of the performance, FIRB would undertake that task. So isn't that directly related? So if you review and then later on you find the violation, wouldn't it still be FIRB?
Well, Mr. President, this particular provision deals with material misrepresentation of information. For example, Mr. President, if the RBEs will not submit accurate information or the information is not truthful, then it's the IPAs who will now be in charge or now be responsible to cancel the registration, Mr. President. So this particular provision, Mr. President, deals with the submission of documents, Mr. President.
Well, anyway, we leave it to His Honor. I know His Honor studied this situation diligently. I was just wanted to point that out.
Yeah.
But may I know if FIRB comes into any information, what would the process be? If FIRB directly learns of situations that would be tantamount to material misrepresentation, as His Honor said, what would FIRB? FIRB would just feed this information to the IPA? Is that the process?
Yeah. Ano yung power niya? Hindi. I just want to point out that yung power ng FIRB. Yeah, pinag-usapan natin yan. But I want to point out yung exact division. Yung exact. Well, Mr. President, that will fall under Section 20, number 2, Mr. President. And we also included in this bill, in this provision, that the FIRB can conduct inquiry, investigation, and filing of appropriate criminal and administrative cases against erring officials and employees in accordance with procedures prescribed under these existing laws. So, Mr. President, if the FIRB, for example, finds out that an IPA is not truthful and is misrepresenting itself, the Investment Promotion Agency can file criminal charges, Mr. President, administratively and criminal, Mr. President. So that will fall under that power, Mr. President.
Noted. Okay, we accept that, Mr. President.
Thank you.
May we just ask His Honor's staff, so that we don't delay this process, to tell us what would those possible administrative violations, administrative or criminal cases, what would they be? Because the concern we have now is the concern that was raised during the deliberations of CREATE, which is there's no accountability on the part of the RBEs. They continue to receive incentives without the proper audit and so on and so forth. So if an IPA fails to conduct the proper audit, or they conduct an audit but it's not thorough, it's not sufficient, we would like to know what are the repercussions such that there would not be a need later on to say, oh, it's not clear it's not clear, the law does not define what was violated, therefore we cannot prosecute. We just want to be sure that they can prosecute.
But Mr. President, we also vested FIRB with regulatory and quasi-judicial powers, Mr. President. So that will fall under their regulatory powers, Mr. President. And with that regulatory powers, they can promulgate rules and regulations, and those IPAs who will not be compliant with rules and regulations can face criminal and administrative charges, Mr. President.
Sorry, can His Honor repeat that? I saw a provision that, but anyway, I
Yeah.
was distracted.
Yeah, Mr. President, we also included regulatory and quasi-judicial functions on the administration and grant of tax incentives by investment promotion agencies. So, in other words, the FIRB can promulgate rules, regulations, and if the IPAs will not follow the rules and regulations, the FIRB can file cases, Mr. President, and that will fall under the number 2 power of the FIRB, Mr. President. So
I understand.
we just specify
and, okay,
the hierarchy.
What His Honor just read or explained satisfies this representation, but on this point, I think one final, just again for consistency, I had pointed out that FIRB was deleted from line 8 on page 54, no? So basically what you have now is after due process, it's the IPA that may cancel the registration, suspend enjoyment of incentives, correct? That is what we have.
Yes, Mr. President. Insofar as misrepresentation of information is concerned, Mr. President.
Insofar as misrepresentation of information. So what is the coverage of what is the impact now of the power of, well, what is the significance now of the newly included section 308B on page 56, line 21, which gives FIRB the power to cancel, suspend, or withdraw?
Actually, Mr. President, there's a proposal from our good Senate President to delete this section and just...
So this will, okay, because it was just
Yeah,
inconsistent.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so if I stand away now, you will make it consistent.
Correct, Mr. President.
Okay, I will do that now. Thank you.
Because over the weekend, I was actually working with our Senate President, and he suggested to already incorporate, because some of the, admittedly, some of the penalties and sanctions are already incorporated in some laws, for example, the charter of the IPA, and we reviewed each one of them, and also existing powers of FIRB, Mr.
Okay.
President. So we just streamlined and harmonized so it will not be verbose, too many...
I may have slightly different views, but at the end of the day, my purpose here is to help His Honor
Thank you, Mr. President.
create a consistent, and it's very difficult. I also rely on my staff to point out if there still are inconsistencies.
Yes,
So thank
Mr. President.
you. I
And we
will-
welcome suggestion, Mr. President. In
Yeah.
fact, the suggestion of deleting this section came from our Senate President,
Okay.
Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cayetano. The sponsor may continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. On page, anterior amendment, Mr. President. On page 54, line 9, after the word agency, comma, delete the phrase as the case may be. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 54, line 14, insert a colon, followed by a proviso which states, provided further, that in case of cancellation of the certificate of registration, the project or activity of the RBE shall cease to be registered and shall be required to pay all appropriate taxes and duties from the date of cancellation order has become final and executory. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 55, delete the entire section 24 from lines 6 to 29, and on page 56, lines 1 to 18. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 56, delete the entire section 25 from line 19 to 30 until page 57, lines 1 to 11. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, same is approved.
On page 57, delete the entire section 26 from lines 12 to 31 until page 58, lines 1 to 28, and renumber the succeeding sections accordingly, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none, same is approved.
And Mr. President, allow me to spread into the records the rationale, and I pointed out that this is an amendment from our good Senate President. The list of violations enumerated under Section 308A are inherent in the regulatory powers of the Fiscal Incentives Review Board. The list of violations under Section 308B is under the power to review and audit the compliance of IPAs and the power of IPAs to cancel the registration of RBEs in case of material representation. The list of violations under Section 308C are already incorporated in the respective charters of the IPAs. For rationale, Mr. President.
Any, note, duly noted.
Ito na yung excise.
Student, ito kay SP po. Ito sir, bago lang. Bago lang. Nili-style lang.
Okay. Mr. President, anterior amendments, Mr. President. Page 10. Okay. Kagagawa lang. Fresh pa. Okay. Basahin ko. 1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session is suspended.